So formal good afternoon and welcome to everyone. We're so very happy to have alumni, community partners, students, faculty, and staff joining us here this afternoon. Thank you, first of all, for taking the time this Saturday for this important presentation and conversation about addressing racial inequity in our country. As we get started, like I said, we'd invite folks to introduce themselves in the chat. And we also believe in keeping the chat lively, so feel free to keep some conversation going there throughout. My name is Maria Dominguez-Gray, and I have the pleasure of serving as the class of 1955 Executive Director of the Phillips Brooks House Association. For those of you who are not as familiar with PBHA, it is a student-led community service nonprofit that has been meeting the needs of Greater Boston through addressing gaps and opportunities and resources for over 115 years. And we do that through direct service and also advocating for structural change. Just over 50 years ago, the Kerner Commission, formed by President Johnson in response to increasing civil unrest fueled by racial disparity, issued a report which stated that America was two societies, Black and white, separate and unequal. Alan Curtis, a fellow PBHAer, was there at the time, and his book, Healing Our Divided Society, about which we are privileged to have him present today, offers an update of the original findings and the current reality of the United States' ongoing failings in reaching racial equity. We are genuinely grateful that you're here today to not only listen to Alan's presentation and the findings, but also spend some time in discussion across generations to think about how we build collective new will, to take action that is needed so we're not having this conversation again 50 years from now. We know this is a short time today and that this work is ongoing. In fact, at PBHA, we see this opportunity as part of our ongoing efforts to build an anti-oppressive, anti-racist society, the work of which has been most recently uplifted through an action and a series of conversations called So You Want to Be an Anti-Racist that the students have been leading following George Floyd's death. We would like to issue a challenge to everyone here today to leave this afternoon having done two things. First, it would be wonderful if you could make a meaningful connection with one other person, whether that's just listening to their story or genuinely sharing in your shared vision for how this world can be different. And second, we would be grateful if you would consider leaving today making one personal commitment to how you will take action following this conversation. Again, whether that's sharing something you've learned with someone else or taking action that someone else suggests in your small group. Thank you in advance for accepting that challenge. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to two of our amazing student leaders, Selma and Clarence, to introduce our main presenter. Selma and Clarence, you guys are up.
For sure. Thank you, Maria, for that wonderful introduction. And once again, welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for an exciting conversation on healing our divided society. My name is Clarence Ndebisi, class of 2024, and I'm the Vehicles and Spaces Coordinator for PBHA. I'm also involved in PBHA programs such as Chance, which does SAT tutoring for students in the Cambridge and Greater Boston area, Minuet, in which I play guitar for residents in nursing homes and hospitals, and David Walker Scholars, which provides mentoring for Black youth.
My name is Salma El Sayed. I'm in the class of 2023, and I'm the Advocacy, Health, and Housing Programming Group Officer at PBHA. I'm also involved with the Harvard Square Homeless Shelter, which is a student-run homeless shelter, the Student Labor Action Movement, a labor organizing group that works with workers in the Boston and Cambridge community, and the Housing Opportunities Program. We will begin this event with a presentation from Alan Curtis, the president-elect of the PBHA Alumni Association.
Alan is also the president and CEO of the Eisenhower Foundation in Washington, D.C. The foundation is the continuation of two presidential commissions, the 1967-68 National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders and the 1968-69 National Commission on the Causes and Prevention of Violence. He was an appointee in the administrations of President Lyndon Johnson and President Jimmy Carter, serving among other positions as Executive Director of the Carter Interagency Urban and Regional Policy Group. Alan has authored and presented on many updates of the commissions and has replicated evidence-based youth development models like quantum opportunities across the nation.
We are lucky to have him share with us his research on evidence-based solutions to economic, educational, criminal justice, and housing issues, and to discuss all of the work that must be done towards reducing poverty, inequality, and racial injustice in the US. In the next 30 minutes, Alan will show us how we can seize this moment to advocate for New Deal scale reform that the challenges we face require. We will have a chance to discuss these issues more after his presentation. Alan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Salma. Thank you, Clarence. Thank you, Maria. Thank you to everyone in the PBH family and everyone at Harvard. I know it's getting to be a nice day here. It's, I guess, a nice day in Boston. So all the more thanks. As I've said when we began this discussion a few minutes ago, I'm aware that reading period is coming up for the students. And so that's all the more reason for us to use this time, I think, wisely. To pursue that, I just want to share that in the early 1960s, many of us at Harvard were motivated by what we could do for our country and about how that complemented the mission of PBH. And then as I sat in a Humanities 5 philosophy section in Seaver Hall that day in 1963, word came that President Kennedy had been killed. Our section leader cried and dismissed us. Ted Sorensen, JFK's speechwriter, came to live next to us in Leverett House. The following summer, I worked on voter registration. Not long after the 1964 election, disturbances began across the urban landscape. There was Watts in Los Angeles in 1965, the year I graduated back in medieval times. Detroit, Newark, and over 150 other disturbances followed across the country. Whites tended to call the disturbances riots. People of color called them protests. And for the most part, I believe the same differences in framing hold true today. In response to the protests, President Johnson formed the Bipartisan National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, as you heard, and it was called the Kerner Commission after its chair, then governor of Illinois, Otto Kerner. Most of the members of the Kerner Commission were privileged white men who bore the imprimatur of the political establishment. Nonetheless, a majority of the Kerner Commission members concluded in 1968 that the underlying cause of the protest was white racism and that America was heading towards two societies, black and white, separate and unequal. With a distinguished national advisory panel, we recently published Healing Our Divided Society, our 50-year update of the Kerner Commission, and we concluded that America still made little progress in reducing racial inequality and poverty. In many ways, actually, we have gone backwards. With your indulgence this afternoon, I would like to share the policy recommendations in Healing Our Divided Society and respectfully ask for your ideas on some of the most important issues of our times. And this is ongoing work, so I really am searching for your feedback in ways in which we can enrich our message. I wish to engage you on the trends since the 60s, on evidence of what works, on national will to scale up success, and on the role of PBH, students, alumni, and faculty partners. To begin, what do we know about trends in racial injustice, inequality, and poverty using the 1968 Kerner Commission as a baseline? These are the principal outcome variables in Healing Our Divided Society, our Kerner update. America has, of course, elected a Harvard graduate as the first African-American president, and now we have an African-American and Asian-American woman as vice president. There has been a dramatic increase in the African-American and Latino middle class, and there are many more African-American and Latino elected officials today than in the 60s. Yet also today, neo-Nazis have made their statements and inflicted deaths in Charlottesville, and white supremacists have invaded the Capitol building in Washington. QAnon and white nationalist movements have substantial online presence. American public school segregation has increased since the Kerner Commission, beginning with the backward-looking federal policy of the 1980s. Black Lives Matter has revealed what Americans did not want to see in Ferguson, And the movement has matured over the last 8 years into its prominent organizing role now in the predominantly nonviolent protests against police violence. Zero tolerance, stop and frisk policing against people of color has failed. American sentencing laws remain racially biased today. About 200,000 people were in prison and jail at the time of the Kerner Commission. Today, because of the crime legislation of the 1980s and the 1990s, the American prison industrial complex now hosts 2.2 million, and they are disproportionately people of color. So at least a tenfold increase. Mass incarceration has become really the present iteration of slavery and Jim Crow. In spite of mass incarceration, America continues to have the highest rates of murder among all industrialized democracies. In many ways, mass incarceration also has become part of American housing policy for the poor. That housing policy has included conscious, purposeful, government-created segregation, as my colleague Richard Rothstein has eloquently documented in his book, The Color of Law. Income inequality and wealth inequality have dramatically increased since the Kerner Commission. The richest 1% of Americans now hold as much wealth as the bottom 90%. Inequality was greatly accelerated by the supply-side created Great Recession of 2008. The speed at which the rich have been pulling away from the rest of America has been breathtaking since the Kerner Commission, and so the narrative today on systemic change needs to be about both race and class. In the last 50 years, most of the economic gains from rising productivity have gone to the wealthiest 1%, to corporate profits, to shareholders, and to CEOs, but not to workers. In the 1950s, top American CEOs made about 20 times as much as their average workers. Today, they make 320 times as much on average. Slaves, of course, were not allowed labor unions, and today, much of corporate America has opposed unions, even though a majority of Americans favor unions in various polls. The ratio of African Americans to white unemployment has remained just about 2 to 1 over all 50 years since the Kerner Commission. White corporate financiers on Wall Street brought us the Great Recession of 2008, yet they have not been punished. They have not been adjudicated into the prison industrial complex. Since the '68 Kerner Commission, the deep poverty rate has increased, in part because of what the late insightful journalist Molly Ivins accurately called the welfare deform legislation of the 1990s. That kind of legislation has failed based on evaluations, for example, by the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. The richest country in history continues to produce the highest rates of overall child poverty among all industrialized democracies. Now, the pandemic has made racial injustice, inequality, and poverty much worse, as you all know. The resulting frustration among people of color and the resulting awareness among at least some white Americans then helped generate the mostly peaceful national protests against police violence after Breonna Taylor was killed in Louisville and George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis. And now we await the outcome of the Minneapolis trial. These have been just a few illustrative illustrations, really, of leading trends since the Kerner Commission. There are many more. If we hope to reverse such trends and heal our divided society, we need, I suggest, policy based on evidence and science, not policy based on conjecture and dogma. Yet today, few American national, state, and local public sector programs are evidence-based. All that public money and so little policy based on what works. When it comes to not following evidence, the most disturbing recent examples have been the failed 2020 policy against the pandemic and the false claims of 2020 election fraud. The very notion of policy based on science and evidence meets resistance among many Americans. We would do well then to use the experience of 2020 to create a much more sustained long-run movement for evidence-based policy. As a positive step forward, I think it is noteworthy that all federal agencies recently received a directive titled Scientific Integrity and Evidence-Based Policymaking. A lot of bureaucratic words, but the underlying meaning is important. For now, we can at least identify and seek to scale up what has proven to work to reduce racial injustice, inequality, and poverty. The Kerner Commission's recommendations began with economic and education priorities. Today, economic policy can only be successful as the pandemic is suppressed. We all know that. Based on the evidence, economic recovery means Keynesian demand-side investments in our workers. I speak here of investments in human capital, job training and job placement combined with living wages, secure health insurance, home leave, and childcare. Full employment with upward mobility for workers is especially needed for new jobs repairing our decaying infrastructure and for new jobs expanding technologies to reverse climate change. As Pulitzer Prize winning author Stephen Pearlstein has reminded us, reducing economic inequality through these and related demand-side policies for average workers won't make us poor. The Scandinavian countries, for example, have much lower inequality than America, but per capita income levels that are almost as high. What evidence-based policy can we identify in education? Well, preschool works. All children should receive it. Pretty straightforward. It is in preschool also that the anti-racism training of Radcliffe Institute fellow Ibram Kendi begins. And such training needs to continue throughout the school years. At the same time, we need racial integration in public schools, much more equitable financing of public schools, greatly improved training of public school teachers, significant expansion of public community schools, and an end to the pipeline from school to prison, and replication of evidence-based youth development models like quantum opportunities, which, for example, we worked on with the Dorchester Youth Collaborative in Boston. The state of Connecticut also has one of the best track records with many of these education policies. Public school integration is furthered by housing integration. For the first time, the federal government needs to comprehensively enforce the Fair Housing Act of 1968. There are evidence-based housing mobility and integration models upon which to build, for example, in Maryland and in Washington State. Harvard has done some of the evaluations. We need as well to return to the successful low-income housing construction that worked decades ago through partnerships between the federal government and private sector intermediaries like the Local Initiative Support Corporation. New construction of affordable housing needs to be accompanied by full funding of housing vouchers for low-income families. What does evidence-based policy mean in criminal justice? Aware of the astronomical cost of racist prison building, states like California and New York and New Jersey and a number of others have reduced their prison populations by about 25% over recent years without any significant increases in crime, and we need to accelerate such reductions across all states. And we need to encourage the incipient movement to transform American prosecution into a system that ensures prosecutors make the fairest decisions, void of non-legal influences and biases. We need to change the status quo where some prosecutors advance their careers by posturing on law and order. I encourage you to read Emily Bazelon's well-received new book titled Charged. What successful place-based programs can work that can be co-targeted to specific geographic locations with truly disadvantaged populations? Certainly an important question for PBH folks. Let me begin here with public safety, which is so much in the headlines today. The police killings of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and all people of color before them finally have generated a more serious national dialogue on the role of police in the community. We need to sustain and enrich that debate. I can only touch upon the many dimensions of police reform here, but for example, instead of what is conventionally called, quote, community policing, unquote, which often amounts to little more than public relations, the Eisenhower Foundation has positively evaluated genuine community police partnerships in very diverse locations like Puerto Rico, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and San Francisco. Nonprofit community-based organization staff and carefully selected police work as equals to mentor youth, create safety, reduce crime, and reduce fear in the neighborhood. We have found that many African-American police chiefs are interested in such models including Dr. Branfield Bard, the Commissioner of Police in Cambridge. Commissioner Bard and I recently presented at the annual meeting of Mentor, the National Mentoring Partnership, and soon will present at the National Partnership for Community Action Agencies. In addition, with increased resources and good training, local nonprofit organizations can undertake some of the present work of police, dealing, for example, with the homeless, serving as community mental health responders, and mediating disputes. In the process, at least some of what has been framed as criminal justice policy can be reframed as public health policy. With good planning, genuine community police partnerships can be designed by creative mayors to stabilize neighborhoods and so encourage community-based banking and small business development, as was pioneered by the South Shore Bank in Chicago. Community-based banking can help finance integrated housing by nonprofit entities like the model Bedford-Stuyvesant Community Restoration Corporation in Brooklyn and the model New Community Corporation in Newark. The integrated housing can facilitate integrated schools and generate good jobs for both community residents and returning ex-offenders. For ex-offender reintegration, there are a number of excellent evidence-based models like the Minnesota Comprehensive Reentry Plan. In other words, what I'm saying is that place-based and evidence-based policy at the grassroots needs to be holistic. Public safety, employment, education, and housing interventions need to be complementary and interdependent. They need not be separate and unequal. There is so much potential for de-siloed, place-based multiple solutions. And I encourage you today to engage in a discussion of de-siloing in your breakout sessions. The scaling up of what works needs to be financed, I suggest, by the scaling down of what doesn't work. What doesn't work is willful indifference to the unequal distribution of prosperity in America. What doesn't work is the present concentration of wealth. What doesn't work is neoliberalism, supply-side economics, and Milton Friedman. What doesn't work is the immorality of the American economic system. What doesn't work includes global symposia in Davos and in Silicon Valley boardrooms, where so-called thought leaders talk down to us, avoid how to reduce inequality, avoid how to change fundamental power equations, and avoid how to reform the rules of the game. Instead, the fashion has been to recite corporate public relations buzzwords like market-driven solutions and social impact investing. What doesn't work includes abuses of phrases like systemic change. Systemic change does not mean a few days of diversity training, corporate tokenism, lots of t-shirts, and television sports ads trying to co-opt Black Lives Matter. Most of all, what doesn't work includes false 1980s rhetoric on government being the problem. The federal government was, in fact, the problem during the 1980s. In that decade, inequality rose sharply. Wages for average Americans stagnated. Labor union power was further reduced. Poverty increased. Homelessness increased. Mass incarceration of people of color rose dramatically. Regulation was weakened and giant corporations began to monopolize industry after industry. I suggest to you that advocates for healing and Kerner priorities need to better remind the American public of these 1980s failures. In fact, I suggest much of the problem in the 1980s was really dishonest government, corporate greed, and absence of responsibility. Today, the solution includes activist government, regulation of greed, well-managed place-based policy, and a larger role for indigenous community-based organizations. Progress in addressing these healing goals is a potentially significant international strategy for America. China, Russia, and other authoritarian dictatorships have routinely and easily deflected our criticisms, pointing to America's own human and civil rights abuses. But if the United States can finally make progress on healing and Kerner priorities, the result can be new soft power in dealing with China and Russia, as has been suggested by Graham Allison at the Kennedy School. Enhanced soft power can increase international confidence in America and help in the much needed repair of our international alliances with traditional partners. And just as a personal note, I want to say here, as I talk about authoritarian dictatorships, that my wife is named Wang Ying. She was a barefoot doctor for Chairman Mao. She was translator, head translator on our first criminal justice delegation to China in the 1980s. So we talk about these issues all the time. But I would say that nonetheless, new American soft power and new evidence-based policy cannot emerge without the new will that Maria alluded to and that the original Kerner Commission said was necessary for progress. What is the use of evidence in our threatened democracy if there is no will to take action, I ask of you? More than 50 years after the Kerner Commission, the creation of new will may be harder to achieve than ever. As he endorsed the Kerner Commission's recommendations in 1968, Dr. King was pursuing new will. He was advocating a multiracial coalition for economic justice among the poor, the working class, and the middle class. And then he was assassinated while protesting nonviolently with sanitation workers in Memphis. The creation of the King Economic Justice Coalition, which embraced and moved beyond the civil rights movement, needs to be one point of departure, I suggest, for the generation of new will in the 21st century. Side by side with Black Lives Matter, the way is being led by people like MacArthur Foundation Genius Award winner Bishop William Barber and his continuation of Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign against the immorality of poverty and inequality. History has shown that successful movements in America are inclusive and opportunistic. Successful movements in America build constituencies that cross-endorse one another in ways that mutually strengthen alliances. Some alliances were in fact strengthened in 2020, for example, through the predominantly peaceful protests against police violence and through voter registration organizing. We now need accelerated convergence among nonprofit healing constituencies to complement and reinforce Reverend Barber and Black Lives Matter. The kind of constituencies that need to cross-endorse and converge more include, for example, the 99% of Americans who have suffered the malfeasance of Wall Street, the 17 million white Americans who live in poverty, re-empowered organized labor, new initiatives to integrate public schools, the movement against America's addiction to guns, the emerging movement for Asian American rights, immigrants, the LGBTQ movement, and my daughter's Generation Z. Strengthened nonprofit alliances to generate new will need to reject calls for returning back to normal in the post-pandemic world. Normal, I suggest, has been the problem in America. Given the present window of opportunity, we need to redefine normal, seize the day, rewrite the rules, reframe the public discourse, and renegotiate the social contract. Importantly, America has in fact reversed that false 1980s rhetoric on diminishing the role of federal government. 2020 hosted the largest expansion of federal financial activity in American history, and we are continuing in 2021. Yet will we be able to rapidly end the pandemic, create full employment with upwardly mobile jobs, deal with climate change, improve the functioning of our democracy, and at the same time, reduce systemic racism, inequality, and poverty? That, I suggest, is a very tall order, to say the least. Nonetheless, the $1.9 trillion pandemic rescue plan that was just passed is a reasonable start from the point of view of Healing and Kerner. This legislative package includes direct payments to individuals and families, a plan to significantly reduce child poverty, extension of unemployment benefits, support for state and federal governments to distribute the vaccine and keep workers employed, resources for public schools, and funds to allow small businesses and nonprofits to continue operations. With Nobel laureate Paul Krugman, I believe this level of activist federal activity is a needed seize the day priority against the pandemic and for the economy. It need not be excessively inflationary. It should be carefully implemented in a de-siloed way to reduce racial injustice, inequality, and poverty. Given the divided American Congress, the $1.9 trillion recovery bill was passed through the legislative process known as budget reconciliation, which requires only a majority vote and so sidesteps the Senate filibuster. The passage generated criticism from some that the legislation was not bipartisan, but that was not true. Polls show that about 70% of Americans supported the $1.9 trillion package, and that includes a majority of citizens polled from each of the major parties. As it is implemented, the legislation may generate even more public support. That public support, that new will, just may enable still more legislation that complements healing and Kerner priorities in the months and years to come. Continued activist government is very much needed because the $1.9 trillion legislation is short-term pandemic relief. Accordingly, new federal legislation now is being negotiated as the next step. The $2 trillion national jobs and infrastructure blueprint has been put on the table for debate over the last couple of weeks. This plan includes repair and infrastructure of highways, roads, bridges for as well as the Amtrak system and airport facilities, but also importantly includes funds for communities destabilized by the past decades of urban renewal and related programs which have oppressed many minority communities. The proposed new package would deliver universal broadband, invest in clean drinking water, clean energy, build and upgrade new public schools, build and upgrade housing for low and moderate income Americans, expand access to home and community-based care for seniors and the disabled, and invest in semiconductor and other manufacturing. Significantly, this legislation now being proposed defines infrastructure, not just in terms of investments in concrete and steel, but also in terms of investments in technology and human capital. Designed with an eye to keeping America competitive, some of the initiatives now being proposed would be financed by tax increases on the wealthy and on corporations, which would bring our tax rates back to where we were in the 1950s. This jobs and infrastructure blueprint makes healing and Kerner sense, I believe, if it can be done in de-siloed ways to create solid, good-paying jobs with upward mobility, and if there is long-term reduction in inequality. Preliminary polls suggest the jobs and infrastructure package has popular support among citizens. It could be passed through budget reconciliation and so again avoid a Senate filibuster. If some form of the jobs and infrastructure plan is signed into law, it is not clear whether other large-scale legislation supportive of healing and Kerner priorities could be passed in the near future. I'm thinking, for example, of education legislation like expansion of Head Start, the scaling up of Kendi anti-racism training, free community college, and creation of equity in public school finance. I'm thinking as well of criminal justice legislation like scaling up community police partnerships and significant reversal of mass incarceration. In this regard, just yesterday, significant spending increases were proposed for federal domestic agencies. So healing and Kerner education and criminal justice policy and priorities just may be possible. But there's still more to what is happening now. We simply cannot seize the day for activist government without strengthening American democracy. The January 6th invasion of the Capitol building in Washington symbolized, among other things, attempts to suppress free and fair elections by people whom the Kerner Commission would have called white racists. The Brennan Center for Justice at New York University Law School has documented that as of just very recently, lawmakers in 47 states have proposed well over 350 bills to tighten voting rules. Georgia, for example, already has passed a shameful voter registration law, voter suppression law. Among other things, it makes it a crime to provide water and food to people who are waiting in line to vote. This is white privilege legislation. To its credit, Major League Baseball has responded to the Georgia legislature by taking the 2021 All-Star Game away from Atlanta. What now will major corporations do in Georgia and throughout the country on these issues? More systemically, to counter the state-level tide of new Jim Crow voter suppression, there is a need for citizens and nonprofit organizations in America to support new federal legislation. The legislation should establish online voting registration, institute nationwide early voting, strengthen mail-in voting systems, protect citizens from being purged from voting rolls, enfranchise the formerly incarcerated, and increase criminal penalties for voter intimidation. America also needs to reinstate the full force of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and to overturn partisan gerrymandering. Such democracy-strengthening federal legislation currently is being proposed, but it can only be passed if the filibuster rule in the Senate is eliminated, modified, or democratized. The complete long-term package for strengthening American democracy includes as well securing campaign finance reform and abolishing the Electoral College. Clearly then, the challenges to American democracy remain formidable. What can PBH and Harvard students, alumni, and faculty do about all of this to heal our divided society? While you continue to excel in community service, I suggest you can enrich your advocacy at the local, state, and national levels. That advocacy needs to remember how President Kennedy asked what we could do for our country. We need more students to commit to the public sector, as was the case in the 1960s. Students, alumni, and faculty can do more to educate the public on the negative trends since the 60s. And you can all better spread the word on programs that work and don't work. Faculty members might look to professors like Danielle Allen, Paul Krugman, Linda Darling-Hammond, and Robert Reich, who are scholars of high standing, but who are also regularly involved in real-world action and write for newspapers in a weekly column mode that communicates to many more people than many professors do. Alumni and students can better engage in de-siloing and in scaling up what works. For example, PBH might seek to work with Cambridge Police Commissioner Bard to replicate the kind of proven evidence-based community police partnerships I've described that include civilian and police mentoring of youth. Engaged faculty and alumni can be drawn not just from the social sciences, from economics departments, schools of education, but also from the humanities and the arts. With funding from the Mellon Foundation, we now are exploring how the humanities and the arts can better amplify, visualize, and reinforce the policy priorities of healing our divided society and the Kerner Commission, and so help to create new will. Recognizing how the media were extensively criticized by the Kerner Commission, students and alumni can organize for regulatory action against Facebook, Twitter, and other platforms that push addicted users deeper and deeper into their own bubbles, intensifying division and hatred. social media make it so easy to insult people without having to look at them in the eye and acknowledge their humanity. Just as fundamental as media reform, we need new best practice master's degree programs that create fresh cohorts of young adults dedicated to healing our divided society. If you want to make money, you can go to the B school. If you want to learn the rules, you can go to the law school. If you want to heal the human body, you can go to med school, as our president of the Alumni Association has done so brilliantly. But if you want to heal our divided society, there are relatively few good graduate options in America, especially at elite universities. We need degree programs that better synthesize academic knowledge and community practice. Students need to know what policies work and what policies don't work. They need to learn how to evaluate, how to communicate, how to organize. They need to absorb the principles of public administration and nonprofit management. They need to practice how to advocate effectively. And then they need to be placed in positions that really make a difference. For the immediate future, though, I urge students, alumni, and faculty as first priority to advocate and organize for voters' rights, to strengthen our democracy, and so to create new will. Otherwise, there is real danger on the horizon. Looking at that horizon, I ask you to recognize with Amanda Gorman, class of 20, that the new dawn blooms as we free it, for there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it. And I ask you to remember bravely with Langston Hughes how long the dream has been deferred. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat or sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Perhaps that dream just sags like a heavy load. Or does it just explode? Thank you very much for your time this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Alan. That presentation was so wonderful. And can we just get a really big, loud round of applause for Alan? Snap, show me the Zoom reactions, put it in the chat. Yes, thank you so much, Alan, for that presentation. Literally just what I needed to hear on a Saturday morning, especially given everything going on in the world. So just appreciate you coming and speaking to us. I personally love the emphasis that you made on the need for youth to be provided with opportunities and educational opportunities to get involved in the work, to develop the skills, the organizing skills, the advocacy skills, to make real systematic change happen, and not just to learn how to say those words, but to learn how to do them as well. So yeah, thank you. And I'll pass it off to Lizzie to let us know what we're doing next.
Yeah, I just want to echo everything that Farah said. Thank you so much.